They told her she was insane. They said no black American soldier would marry a German woman. They called her a liar, a fantasist, a disgrace. But Greta Muller knew the truth, and she would move heaven and earth to prove it, even as they tried to take away the only piece of him she had left. Spring arrived late to Miesbach in 1945. The small Bavarian town had survived the war relatively intact, its alpine valleys and medieval architecture spared the worst of the bombing campaigns that had devastated Germany's industrial cities. But survival came with a price. By April, the sound of American tanks rumbling through the cobblestone streets announced the occupation, and with it came a reckoning that many residents had desperately tried to avoid. Greta Muller stood at the hospital window, her nurse's apron stained with blood that had long since dried to rust. At 24, she had already lived through more loss than most people experience in a lifetime. Her father, a postal clerk who had never wanted war, died at Stalingrad. Her younger brother, conscripted at 17, never returned from France. Her mother perished in the Munich bombings of 1944, crushed beneath the rubble of their family home, while Greta worked a double shift at this very hospital. Now she watched as a column of American tanks rolled into the town square, their olive-drab paint covered in mud and battle scars. But something was different about these tankers. As the crews dismounted, stretching their cramped limbs and lighting cigarettes, Greta realized with a start that every single soldier she could see was black. She'd never seen a black person before. Nazi propaganda had filled her childhood with monstrous caricatures, racist lies designed to dehumanize anyone who did not fit their twisted ideal. But these men laughing and joking below her window were simply human, exhausted, yes, battle-worn, certainly, but human in every sense that mattered. One of the tanks bore a distinctive emblem, a Black Panther in mid-leap. Years later, Greta would learn that this was the 761st Tank Battalion, an all-black unit that had fought for 183 consecutive days across France, Belgium, and Germany. They had supported General Patton's Third Army, breached the Siegfried Line, and liberated concentration camps. But in that moment, she knew only that they were here, and that wounded men would soon fill her hospital beds. She was right. Within hours, casualties began arriving. Most were from skirmishes with retreating Wehrmacht units making desperate last stands. But one soldier had been wounded by shrapnel from a mine explosion during the final push into town. Sergeant James Washington was carried in on a stretcher, conscious but in obvious pain. Blood seeped through the field, dressing on his left thigh, and his dark skin had taken on an ashen quality that Greta recognized immediately as shock setting in. She moved quickly, directing the stretcher-bearers to an empty bed and calling for the doctor. While they waited, she began cutting away his torn uniform trousers to assess the wound. Her hands were steady, professional. She had done this 1,000 times for German soldiers, and she would do it 1,000 more for American ones, if that was what the occupation required. James looked up at her through pain-glazed eyes and said something in English. She did not understand the words, but the tone was clear, gratitude mixed with embarrassment at his vulnerability. She smiled, hoping to convey reassurance despite the language barrier, and continued her work. The shrapnel wounds were serious but not life-threatening if they could prevent infection. She cleaned and dressed them while the doctor, an elderly German physician who had stayed when younger colleagues fled, performed the necessary surgery to remove the embedded metal fragments. James remained in the hospital for 3 weeks. During that time, Greta found herself assigned to his care more often than not. Perhaps it was because she was one of the few nurses who did not visibly recoil from treating black soldiers. The older nurses, their heads still full of propaganda, muttered about how unnatural it was. But Greta had lost everything to the ideology that preached such hatred, and she would not carry its poison into her future. She began teaching James's simple German phrases. He taught her English in return. They started with practical medical terms, then moved to pleasantries, then to longer conversations conducted in a hybrid language that belonged only to them. She learned that he was from Biloxi, Mississippi, a place she could not have found on a map. He was 26 years old, had worked as a dockloader before the war, and had 3 sisters he worried about constantly. He learned that she was alone in the world now, that she had lost everyone, that some days the weight of survival felt heavier than death would have been. He did not offer false comfort or empty platitudes. He simply listened, and in his listening Greta felt seen for the first time in years. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the hospital, the news was met with numb silence from the German staff, and muted celebration from the American patients. No one quite knew what came next. The world had been at war for so long that peace felt like a foreign concept, a language no one remembered how to speak. James was discharged from the hospital the following week. His leg had healed well, though he would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life. Greta had grown accustomed to his presence on the ward, and his absence left a hollow space she had not anticipated. But 3 days later, he returned, not as a patient, but as a visitor, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. He found her during her break, sitting in the hospital's damaged courtyard, where spring flowers pushed defiantly through the rubble. He sat beside her without asking permission, and she found she did not mind. He handed her the package. Inside was chocolate, the real kind, not the ersatz substitutes that had sustained Germany through years of blockade. It was the most valuable gift anyone could offer in that starved spring. They sat together in comfortable silence, breaking the chocolate into small pieces to make it last, and Greta realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She had feelings for this man, real feelings that went beyond gratitude or wartime desperation. Over the following weeks, James returned whenever his duties allowed. The American occupation forces were settling in, establishing military government, processing displaced persons, and managing the massive logistical challenge of feeding millions of starving Germans, while simultaneously searching for war criminals. James and his unit were stationed in Miesbach as part of the occupation force, a fact that both gave him relative freedom and constrained him severely. Official policy forbade fraternization between American troops and German civilians. Violators faced court-martial, reduction in rank, or worse. But the policy was enforced selectively, and James suspected that violations involving black soldiers and white German women would be punished far more harshly than those involving white soldiers. Still, they met, carefully, quietly, in spaces where the military police were unlikely to patrol. The ruined courtyard became their refuge. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they sat in silence, each drawing comfort from the other's presence. Slowly, carefully, friendship deepened into something neither had expected to find in the ashes of war. James told her about America, but his stories were complicated by truths she struggled to understand. He had fought for a country that treated him as a second-class citizen. The same army that sent him to liberate Europe kept black soldiers in segregated units, denied them promotions their white peers received automatically, and shipped them home to states where they could not vote, could not eat in the same restaurants as white people, and could be murdered with impunity for challenging the racial hierarchy. When he described the reality of Jim Crow laws in Mississippi, Greta was horrified. She had just lived through 12 years of Nazi racial ideology, had seen where such thinking led, and now James was telling her that America, the great liberator, enforced its own version of racial apartheid. But he still believed in the promise of America, the ideal, if not the reality. He believed that the war had changed things, that black soldiers had proven themselves, that change was coming. Greta heard the hope in his voice and wanted desperately to believe him, even as she feared what that reality might mean for any future they tried to build together. In June, James asked her to marry him. They were sitting in their courtyard, watching the sun set behind the Alps, when he took her hand and spoke the words in careful German. Greta's first instinct was to say yes immediately, but she forced herself to think practically. She asked the questions that needed asking. Where would they live? How would they survive? What would his family say about him marrying a German woman, a former enemy? What would the army say? James had thought through all of it. He would request permission to marry from his commanding officer, as regulations required. The paperwork would take time, but other soldiers were marrying European women. The army was already discussing legislation to help war brides immigrate to the United States. Once they had official approval, he would bring her home to America. They would start fresh, build a life together, leave the war behind. He made it sound possible, even simple. Greta knew it would be neither, but she said yes anyway. Some risks were worth taking, some futures were worth fighting for. The next challenge was finding someone willing to marry them. The local German churches would not perform a marriage between a German woman and an occupation soldier without military approval, and military approval required command authorization that James knew would be difficult to obtain. His unit commander was sympathetic to black soldiers, but also protective of his men. He would not want to expose James to official retaliation or unofficial violence. James turned to the one person he thought might help, Captain William Barnes, one of the few black chaplains serving with occupation forces in Bavaria. Captain Barnes had grown up in Philadelphia, studied theology at Howard University, and served as a chaplain throughout the war. He had seen too many injustices, too many good men denied basic human dignity, to let regulations stand in the way of two people who wanted to commit their lives to each other. When James and Greta met with him in the small office he maintained in a requisitioned German building, Barnes listened to their story and made his decision quickly. He would perform the ceremony, he told them, but they needed to understand the risks. Without official approval, the marriage would exist in a legal gray area. It might not be recognized by military authorities or by the German government. If James was transferred before the paperwork was processed, they might face long separation. If officials actively opposed the marriage, they had tools at their disposal to make life very difficult. James and Greta looked at each other and agreed they would take the risk. The ceremony took place on June 23, 1945, in a small room that had once been a beer hall's private dining area. Two witnesses attended, Corporal Marcus Johnson and Private Leonard Hayes, both members of the 761st and Friends of James. Captain Barnes wore his chaplain's uniform. Greta wore the best dress she owned, carefully mended to hide where moths had eaten through the fabric during years of storage. There were no flowers, no music, no family to witness the moment. But when Captain Barnes pronounced them husband and wife, and James kissed Greta with gentle reverence, the joy in that room was real and complete. Captain Barnes gave them a marriage certificate marked pending official approval and promised to file the paperwork through proper channels as soon as possible. In the meantime, James and Greta were married in the eyes of God and in their own hearts, and that would have to be enough. They had 3 weeks together as husband and wife before the orders came through. The 761st Tank Battalion was being shipped back to the United States as part of the demobilization effort. Thousands of soldiers were returning home every day, and the Army needed to process them through separation centers and return them to civilian life. James received 48 hours' notice, 2 days to pack his gear, settle his affairs, and say goodbye to the woman he had just married. Those final 2 days blurred together in Greta's memory. James spent every possible moment with her, sneaking away from duties whenever he could. He gave her everything that might help her navigate the bureaucratic maze ahead. His dog tags on their chain, his home address in Biloxi carefully written on a piece of paper, a copy of their marriage certificate, and a photograph of him standing proudly in front of his tank with other members of his crew. He promised to write immediately upon arriving in the States. He would send letters to the hospital in Miesbach where she still worked. He would begin processing the paperwork to bring her to America. The War Brides Act was making its way through Congress and everyone said it would pass within months. By Christmas, he promised, they would be together again. Greta held him tightly that last night, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the sound of his heartbeat, the warmth of his presence. She had learned not to trust promises during the war, had seen too many futures destroyed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But she wanted to believe this promise. She needed to believe. The 761st rolled out of Miesbach on July 15, 1945. Greta stood at the same hospital window where she had first seen them arrive, watching the tanks and trucks disappear down the mountain road. She touched the dog tags hanging beneath her blouse and whispered a prayer to a God she was not sure she still believed in. James had suggested she move to Munich, where occupation authorities were establishing central offices to process war brides' claims. The larger city would have better resources, better communication links to America, better opportunities for work. Greta gave notice at the hospital, packed her few belongings, and made the journey north. Munich was a city of ghosts. Allied bombing had reduced large sections to rubble. People lived in basements and cellars, emerging like stunned survivors of an apocalypse to pick through the ruins, but life continued with stubborn persistence. Markets emerged in bomb craters. Children played games in the shells of destroyed buildings. The American occupation forces worked to restore basic services while simultaneously hunting for Nazi war criminals and processing millions of displaced persons. Greta found work as a translator at an American civil affairs office. Her English was improving rapidly, and she had the careful attention to detail that bureaucratic work required. The job paid in occupation currency and came with weekly rations that meant she would not starve. She rented a small room in a boarding house run by a widow named Frau Schmidt. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a chair, but it had 4 walls and a door that locked. After years of war, that was luxury enough. Every day, Greta checked with the American Postal Service for letters from James. None came. She told herself that transatlantic mail was slow, that processing through military channels took time, that she needed to be patient. But as July turned to August and August crept toward September, Patience became harder to maintain. She wrote letters to the address in Biloxi he had given her. She sent 3, carefully composed in English, explaining who she was and asking James to respond. All 3 were returned weeks later, marked addressee unknown. In September, Greta realized she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable. Missed cycles, morning nausea, a strange exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. She sat on her narrow bed and calculated dates, confirming what she already knew. The baby had been conceived during those last desperate days before James left. Terror and joy fought for dominance in her heart. A baby, James's baby. A piece of him that would be hers no matter what else happened. But also, a baby she would have to raise alone if she could not reach her husband. A baby that would be visibly mixed race in a country still grappling with Nazi racial ideology. A baby that Frau Schmidt would discover soon enough. She tried to contact Army records offices, but the bureaucracy was impenetrable. Every office sent her to another office. Forms required stamps that required approvals, that required documentation she did not have. Official marriage certificates were filed in triplicate through multiple channels, and hers was marked pending approval, until Captain Barnes processed the paperwork, and until someone in the Army bureaucracy actually approved it. Her marriage existed in a legal limbo that might as well have been quicksand. By October, her pregnancy was becoming visible. Frau Schmidt noticed and asked pointed questions. Greta told her the truth. She was married to an American soldier who had returned to the States, and she was waiting for paperwork to join him. Frau Schmidt's face hardened. Which soldier? What unit? Where is your proof? Greta showed her the marriage certificate, the photograph, the dog tags. Frau Schmidt examined them with suspicious eyes and then delivered her verdict. Greta needed to find other accommodations. The boarding house catered to respectable women, not those who had fraternized with occupiers and now found themselves in trouble. The fact that Greta was legally married meant nothing to Frau Schmidt. The fact that the soldier in question was black meant even less. In fact, it made things worse. Frau Schmidt had survived the Nazi years by keeping her head down and her opinions flexible, and she intended to survive the occupation the same way. Having a German woman pregnant with a black child under her roof would bring exactly the kind of attention she wished to avoid. Greta had 1 week to leave. She found a room in a displaced persons shelter, a converted school building housing refugees, former forced laborers and Germans who had lost everything in the war. It was crowded, loud, and offered no privacy. But it was shelter, and she was in no position to be selective. In November, Greta made one more attempt to contact American authorities about her marriage. She presented herself at the Civil Affairs office where she worked and asked to speak with someone about war brides cases. The officer who met with her was a Major Thompson, a white man from Virginia who radiated the casual certainty of someone who had never been questioned. She explained her situation, married to a soldier from the 761st Tank Battalion, pregnant, unable to contact her husband, seeking help to process her immigration papers. Major Thompson listened with growing skepticism. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked the question that would haunt her nightmares. "You're telling me a colored soldier married you?" She nodded, producing her evidence. The certificate, the photograph, the dog tags. Major Thompson examined the marriage certificate with obvious doubt. "This isn't in our official records. Are you certain this is legitimate? These Negro units, well, they weren't exactly frontline troops. Saw very little real action. You sure this soldier wasn't just trying to take advantage of you?" Greta felt rage building in her chest, but she forced her voice to remain calm and professional. The 761st had fought for 183 consecutive days. They had earned multiple commendations. James had been wounded in combat. How dare this officer dismiss their service? But Major Thompson was not interested in her defense of the 761st. He was interested in dismissing her claim as quickly as possible. He told her that without official documentation in Army records, he could not help her. She should contact her supposed husband directly and have him initiate the proper paperwork from his end. She tried to explain that she had been unable to reach James, that something must have happened, that she needed help. Major Thompson's patience evaporated. He suggested, in terms barely polite enough to avoid being overtly insulting, that perhaps she had been deceived. Perhaps the marriage was not legitimate. Perhaps she should consider other explanations for her current situation. Greta left his office fighting tears of frustration and rage. She was not deceived. She was not crazy. James was real. Their marriage was real, and something had gone terribly wrong. But if the American authorities would not help her, who would? The answer came from an unexpected source. In the displaced persons shelter, Greta met a Belgian woman named Elise. Elise was also married to an American soldier, also waiting for her immigration paperwork to be processed, also finding the bureaucracy maddeningly slow. But Elise had advantages Greta lacked. Her marriage had been officially approved before her husband's unit shipped out, and her husband was white. Still, Elise's natural sense of justice was offended by what Greta was experiencing. She introduced Greta to a network of war brides, women from across Europe who were trying to reunite with their American husbands. They met in church basements, shared information about which officials were helpful and which were obstructionist, pooled their resources to hire translators and lawyers when necessary. More importantly, Elise knew other women whose husbands were black soldiers. These women faced unique obstacles. Their marriages were more likely to be lost in bureaucratic processing. Their paperwork took longer to approve. Officials were more likely to question the legitimacy of their claims. Through this network, Greta learned something crucial. Several women were married to men from the 761st Tank Battalion. One of them, a British woman named Margaret, had successfully immigrated to New York where her husband had been discharged. Margaret had maintained contact with other unit members. Greta wrote to Margaret, pouring out her story and begging for any information about James. Margaret's response took 6 weeks to arrive, but it contained the first real lead Greta had found in months. Margaret confirmed that the 761st had been processed through Camp Kilmer in New Jersey before the soldiers were discharged to their home states. Margaret's husband had mentioned James Washington, remembered him talking constantly about his German wife and the baby he hoped was on the way. But after the men dispersed to their home states, Margaret's husband had lost contact with James. However, Margaret provided addresses for 3 other 761st veterans: Corporal Marcus Johnson in New York, Sergeant David Thompson in Chicago, and Private Leonard Hayes in Detroit. All 3 had been present at the wedding and might have information. Greta's baby was born in December 1945 in the Charity Ward Unit Hospital. The labor was long and difficult, but when the nurses finally placed her son in her arms, Greta felt a joy so fierce it temporarily obliterated her fear and uncertainty. She named him James, after his father. Little James had his mother's blue eyes, but his father's dark hair and skin tone that was several shades darker than Greta's own. Could be no hiding his parent, no pretending he was anything other than what he was, the child of a black American soldier and a German woman. The hospital staff treated her with cool professionalism, but she heard the whispers: single mother, occupation baby, Negro child. The judgment was palpable, a weight that pressed down on her, even in her exhausted state. 2 weeks after James was born, Greta received a visit from a representative of the German Youth Welfare Office. The official, a stern woman named Frau Becker, inspected the baby with clinical detachment and then delivered her verdict. The Youth Welfare Office had concerns about Greta's ability to properly raise a mixed-raced child. These children had special needs, required special care, and faced special challenges in German society. There were facilities, Frau Becker explained in a tone that suggested she was offering a great kindness, where such children could be placed. They would receive appropriate care, be raised with others like themselves, and Greta would be free to rebuild her life without the burden of a child who had faced discrimination at every turn. Greta clutched baby James tighter and said the only word that mattered: no. Frau Becker's expression hardened. She informed Greta that if she insisted on keeping the child, she would need to prove she could provide appropriate care. She would need to demonstrate stable housing, steady income, and family support. More importantly, she would need to prove that baby James was not illegitimate. If Greta was truly married to an American soldier, she needed to provide official documentation. Greta had 30 days to provide proof of marriage, or the Youth Welfare Office would petition a court to remove baby James from her care. The state had an obligation to protect children who could not protect themselves, Frau Becker said, and she intended to fulfill that obligation. After Frau Becker left, Greta held her baby and wept. She had survived war, bombing, loss, displacement, and poverty. But this threat, the possibility of losing the only family she had left, brought her to her breaking point. She was not crazy. James was real. Their marriage was real. Their love was real. And she would prove it, no matter what it took. In January 1946, Greta sent letters to all 3 veterans Margaret had identified. She wrote to Corporal Marcus Johnson in New York, Sergeant David Thompson in Chicago, and Private Leonard Hayes in Detroit. In each letter she explained who she was, described her marriage to James, and begged for any information about his whereabouts. The waiting was agony. International mail was slow under the best circumstances, and these were not the best circumstances. Weeks passed with no response. Greta's 30-day deadline ticked closer. She continued working as a translator, caring for baby James, and trying to prepare for a custody hearing she did not know how to win. The response from Marcus Johnson arrived in early February. His letter was brief, but contained the words Greta had been desperate to hear. "I remember Jimmy. I remember the wedding. I was there." Marcus confirmed everything. James had talked constantly about Greta during the voyage home and during processing at Camp Kilmer. He had been determined to bring her to America, had spoken about filing paperwork immediately. But something had happened after the men dispersed to their home states. Marcus had returned to New York and lost contact with James. He knew James had gone back to Mississippi, but after that, silence. Marcus provided one more crucial piece of information. Captain William Barnes, the chaplain who had performed the wedding, was now assigned to a military base in New Jersey. Barnes would have records of the ceremony. He might be able to provide official documentation. Greta immediately wrote to Captain Barnes, explaining her desperate situation. She also wrote to Sergeant Thompson and Private Hayes, hoping they might have additional information. The response from Thompson arrived 3 weeks later and contained details that made Greta's blood run cold. Thompson had stayed in touch with James for the first few weeks after they returned to the States. James had gone to the Veterans Administration office in Biloxi to inquire about processing his marriage paperwork and applying for benefits under the GI Bill. The VA official, a white man, had looked at James's marriage certificate and declared it invalid due to missing documentation. When James protested that the certificate was legitimate, that Captain Barnes had filed the paperwork through proper channels, the official told him that no such paperwork existed in their system. Without official documentation, the marriage was not recognized. James had argued. He had raised his voice, demanded to know how official paperwork could simply disappear. The VA official had called for security. James had been escorted out of the building and warned that if he returned and caused further disturbance, he would be arrested for disturbing the peace. Thompson's letter continued with information that chilled Greta to her core. This treatment was not unique to James. Black veterans across the South were being systematically denied GI Bill benefits that white veterans received automatically. They were being refused the low-interest home loans, the business loans, the educational benefits that the GI Bill promised. Officials found technicalities, lost paperwork, discovered reasons why these particular applicants did not qualify. For black veterans who had risked their lives for their country, only to return home to Jim Crow laws and violent racism, the betrayal was complete. Private Hayes's letter arrived soon after and added another piece to the puzzle. Hayes had received 2 letters from James in late August and early September 1945. In those letters, James had expressed frustration about the VA, but determination to fight for his rights. He had written letters to Greta in Germany, though Hayes now suspected those letters had been intercepted or lost by military postal services that saw no reason to facilitate correspondence between a black soldier and a white German woman. James's last letter to Hayes, dated September 20th, 1945, mentioned that he was going back to the VA office to demand action. He was going to insist they process his paperwork. He was going to stand up for his rights as a veteran and as a husband. Hayes had never received another letter from James. Attempts to contact him went unanswered. Inquiries to James's last known address in Biloxi received no response. Hayes included a final paragraph that Greta would read dozens of times, each reading more painful than the last. In 1945 and 1946, black veterans who returned to the South faced extreme violence. Those who had served their country, who had worn the uniform with pride, were seen as threats to the racial hierarchy. They had seen the world beyond Jim Crow. They had been treated as equals, at least by some people in some places. They had expectations of dignity and rights. The white supremacist power structure in the Deep South could not tolerate such expectations. Multiple black veterans had been beaten, terrorized, or murdered for acting uppity, for demanding their rights, for refusing to accept their assigned place in the racial hierarchy. Isaac Woodard, a veteran still in uniform, had been beaten and blinded by police in South Carolina. Maxio Snipes had been murdered in Georgia for voting. The list went on, a litany of violence against men who had served their country honorably. Hayes did not say explicitly what he feared had happened to James. He did not need to. The implication was clear, and it left Greta shaking with grief and rage. Her custody hearing was 2 weeks away. She now had letters from 3 veterans confirming her marriage, confirming James's existence, confirming his intentions. But she did not have her husband, and German officials had made clear that letters were not sufficient proof. Elise, her Belgian friend from the War Brides network, suggested a different approach. Stop trying to convince German bureaucrats. Go to the press. Tell your story to people who might care, who might apply pressure that officials could not ignore. Greta was desperate enough to try anything. She wrote to two newspapers, Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper widely read by American service members, and the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the largest and most influential black newspapers in America. Her letter to the Pittsburgh Courier was personal and direct. She explained her situation, included copies of the letters from the 761st veterans, and asked a simple question: what happened to Sergeant James Washington? The Pittsburgh Courier, with its circulation of over 200,000 readers, had built its reputation on advocating for black Americans and exposing injustice. The editors saw in Greta's letter a story that connected multiple issues they had been covering: the treatment of black veterans, discrimination in the application of GI Bill benefits, the erasure of black soldiers' contributions to the war effort, and the violence facing black men who dared to assert their rights. In early April 1946, the Pittsburgh Courier ran Greta's story on its front page. The headline read, "German War Bride Seeks Missing 761st Tanker. Was Hero Husband Silenced for Marrying White Woman?" The article included the photograph of James in front of his tank, excerpts from the letters from Marcus Johnson and David Thompson, and a powerful sidebar about the 761st Tank Battalion's distinguished service record. The paper called for an investigation into James's disappearance and demanded answers from Veterans Administration officials in Mississippi. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Black veterans across the country, many of whom had experienced similar discrimination and violence, rallied to Greta's cause. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and black churches circulated the story. Letters poured into the Pittsburgh Courier's offices offering support, sharing similar stories, demanding justice. Most importantly, more veterans from the 761st Tank Battalion came forward. They had read the article, recognized James from the photograph, and remembered his wedding to the German nurse. They were willing to testify on Greta's behalf. Within days, 8 veterans of the 761st signed a joint affidavit confirming James's marriage to Greta. The affidavit, notarized and official, testified to James's character, confirmed the wedding ceremony, and documented his stated intentions to bring Greta to America. The veterans demanded an official investigation into James's disappearance and insisted that the Army recognize the validity of his marriage. Captain William Barnes, the chaplain who had performed the ceremony, came forward with his own records. He had indeed filed the marriage paperwork through official channels, complete with the required signatures and documentation. He had received no response, no confirmation, no indication that the paperwork had been received. Now he understood why. Someone in the bureaucracy had buried it deliberately. The NAACP, which had been advocating for black veterans' rights, assigned a lawyer to Greta's case. The lawyer, a determined woman named Eleanor Price, began preparing for the custody hearing with the ammunition that Greta's public appeal had provided. But even as support built, the truth about James remained elusive. The Pittsburgh Courier sent a reporter to Biloxi, Mississippi to investigate. What he found was a wall of silence. The Veterans Administration Office claimed to have no records of Sergeant James Washington requesting assistance. The local sheriff's office had never heard of him. Nobody knew anything, but the reporter was persistent. He found James's aunt, an elderly woman named Clara Washington, still living in a small house on the outskirts of town. At first she refused to talk, but when the reporter mentioned Greta and baby James, something shifted in her expression. She invited him inside, glanced nervously at the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors, and told him what she knew. James had come home from the war in July 1945. He had been proud of his service, proud of his unit, and excited about his new wife. He had shown Clara the photographs, told her about Greta, and promised that soon he would bring her to America. But when James went to the VA office to process the necessary paperwork, he had been humiliated and turned away. When he protested, when he insisted on his rights as a veteran, things had escalated quickly. Within days, James had received a visit from several white men. Clara did not know exactly who they were, but she knew their type. They had made it clear that James needed to stop making trouble, stop demanding things he had no right to demand. James had been angry but not cowed. He told Clara he was going back to the VA office, that he would not be intimidated, that he had fought for his country and earned the right to marry whoever he chose. That was the last time Clara saw him. 3 days later, neighbors whispered that something had happened. There had been shouting, the sound of violence, a truck driving away in the night. When Clara went to James's rented room, he was gone. His few belongings were undisturbed, but James had vanished. She'd been afraid to ask questions. Black people who asked too many questions about violence against other black people often found themselves targets of that same violence. She had grieved privately, waited for news that never came, and tried to survive in a place where survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. The reporter asked if she thought James was dead. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. She had no body, no grave, no official confirmation. But she knew, in the way that black people in the Deep South learned to know such things, that her nephew had been murdered for the crime of insisting on his dignity. The reporter's article ran in the Pittsburgh Courier 1 week before Greta's custody hearing. It was a devastating piece of investigative journalism that documented not just James's probable murder, but the systematic violence facing black veterans across the South. The article named officials, quoted Clara Washington's testimony, and demanded accountability from a system that had failed its black service members at every level. Greta read the article in her small room in the displaced persons shelter, holding baby James against her chest, and finally allowed herself to grieve. She had known, somewhere deep in her heart, that James was not coming back, but knowing and having it confirmed were two different things. She wept for the husband she had loved and lost. She wept for the future they would never have. She wept for baby James, who would never know his father. And she wept for James himself, a good man who had survived war only to be murdered by the racism of his own country. But grief would have to wait. The custody hearing was in 3 days, and Greta still had to fight for her son. The hearing took place in a Munich courtroom on April 28, 1946. Greta arrived early, carrying baby James and accompanied by Eleanor Price, the NAACP lawyer who had traveled from Berlin to represent her. The courtroom was far more crowded than anyone had anticipated. Members of the War Brides Network filled several rows, a show of solidarity that Greta found deeply moving. Reporters from Stars and Stripes and the Pittsburgh Courier were present, along with representatives from several German newspapers. American military officials sat stiffly in the back, clearly uncomfortable with the attention the case had attracted. The presiding judge, a German official named Judge Hermann Adler, was a man in his 60s who had survived the Nazi years by keeping his judicial head down. He did not look pleased to be presiding over a case that had become an international cause célèbre. Frau Becker, the youth welfare official who had initiated the custody challenge, presented her case first. She argued that baby James required specialized care that an unwed mother could not provide. She questioned the legitimacy of Greta's marriage, noting that official Army records did not confirm it. She suggested that the child would be better served in an institutional setting where he could receive appropriate care. Eleanor Price's response was devastating. She presented the joint affidavit signed by 8 veterans of the 761st Tank Battalion. She submitted Captain Barnes's records documenting the marriage ceremony. She introduced letters from Marcus Johnson, David Thompson, and Leonard Hayes, all testifying to James Washington's existence and his marriage to Greta. But the moment that changed everything came when the courtroom doors opened and 5 men entered in military uniform. They were veterans of the 761st Tank Battalion, and they had traveled to Germany at their own expense to testify on Greta's behalf. Sergeant David Thompson led them. Behind him came Marcus Johnson, Leonard Hayes, and 2 other veterans who had served alongside James, Private First Class Robert Mitchell and Corporal Thomas Jackson. They wore their uniforms with pride, their medals visible on their chests, the distinctive Black Panther insignia of the 761st displayed prominently. Their presence transformed the courtroom. These were not abstract names on documents. These were men who had fought for their country, men whose service was undeniable, even if it had been systematically undervalued. Judge Adler called Sergeant Thompson to testify. Thompson stood straight, his bearing military despite having been discharged months earlier, and spoke with quiet authority. He testified that he had known Sergeant James Washington for 2 years. They had served together in combat across Europe. James had been a good soldier, a good man, someone Thompson trusted with his life. Thompson had been present at James's wedding to Greta Muller. The ceremony had been legitimate, performed by a military chaplain, witnessed by fellow soldiers. James had spoken constantly about Greta, about his plans to bring her to America, about the family they would build together. Thompson paused, his voice thickening with emotion, before continuing. When they returned to America, James had tried to do everything right. He had followed the rules, filed the paperwork, requested the benefits he had earned, and for his trouble, for daring to insist on his rights as a veteran and a husband, James had been threatened, denied, and ultimately silenced. Thompson looked directly at Judge Adler and said words that would be quoted in newspapers across America. Mrs. Washington is not crazy. She is not a liar. She is a widow, and her husband died because he loved her and because he believed his country would honor its promises to its black soldiers. We were wrong to believe. But Jimmy Washington was real. His marriage was real, and his son deserves to know that his father was a hero. One by one, the other veterans testified. Marcus Johnson spoke about witnessing the wedding ceremony, about James's joy and hope. Leonard Hayes described James's letters, his determination to reunite with Greta, his refusal to be intimidated. Robert Mitchell and Thomas Jackson testified to James's character, his bravery in combat, his essential decency. Captain Barnes testified last, still in uniform, carrying his official records. He explained that he had performed the marriage ceremony in accordance with his duties as a chaplain. He had filed the necessary paperwork through official military channel. If that paperwork had subsequently disappeared, it was not due to any irregularity in the ceremony itself, but due to a system that did not want to acknowledge marriages between black soldiers and white European women. When Barnes finished, the courtroom was silent. Frau Becker looked uncertain, her earlier confidence shaken. Judge Adler studied the documents before him, his expression unreadable. Eleanor Price made her closing argument. She spoke about the sacrifices these men had made, about the promises their country had broken, about the injustice of denying recognition to a legitimate marriage simply because it crossed racial lines. She noted that Germany, which had just emerged from 12 years of murderous racial ideology, was now in a position to either perpetuate that ideology or reject it decisively. She concluded by pointing to Greta, holding baby James in her arms. This woman has lost everything except her son and her memory of the man she loved. To take her child would be to complete the injustice that began when her husband was denied his rights as a veteran. I ask this court to recognize what is plainly true. Greta Washington is a married woman, and her son is the legitimate child of an American soldier who served his country with honor. Judge Adler called for a recess. The wait was agonizing. Greta sat with Eleanor Price and the War Brides Network members, trying to prepare herself for either outcome. The veterans remained in the courtroom, a silent wall of support. When Judge Adler returned, he did not waste time. He had reviewed the evidence, he announced, and found it overwhelmingly convincing. The marriage between Greta Muller and Sergeant James Washington was legitimate and would be recognized by this court. Greta would retain full custody of her son. The petition by the Youth Welfare Office was denied, but Judge Adler was not finished. He spoke directly to Frau Becker, his voice sharp with criticism. He noted that the Youth Welfare Office's eagerness to separate this particular child from his mother seemed to have more to do with the child's racial background than with any legitimate concern for his welfare. He suggested that the office examine its procedures and its prejudices before bringing similar cases in the future. Finally, Judge Adler addressed Greta. He acknowledged the injustice she had faced, both from German officials and from American authorities. He expressed his condolences for the loss of her husband, and he wished her well in whatever future she chose to build. The courtroom erupted in applause as Judge Adler concluded. Greta stood, clutching baby James, tears streaming down her face. The veterans surrounded her, offering congratulations and support. Eleanor Price shook her hand firmly, professional pride evident in her expression, but the victory was bittersweet. Greta had proven her marriage was real. She had secured custody of her son. But James was still gone, and no court ruling could bring him back. In the weeks following the hearing, the veterans helped Greta navigate the bureaucracy of immigration. Now that her marriage was officially recognized, she qualified for entry to the United States under the War Brides Act of 1945, which allowed foreign-born spouses of American service members to immigrate with expedited processing. The veterans pooled their resources to pay for her passage. They arranged for housing in New York, where several of them had settled after the war. They promised to help her find work, to introduce her to the community of black Americans who might welcome her where white America would not. Greta accepted their help with gratitude. She had no desire to remain in Germany, a country that had brought her nothing but loss. But America, the country James had described with such complicated hope, terrified her. She would be a German woman in a nation that had just defeated Germany. She would be a white woman in black communities that might not trust her. She would be a widow raising a mixed-race child in a country that legally enforced racial segregation. But she would do it, for James, for their son, for the future James had believed was possible even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Greta and baby James boarded a ship in Hamburg in September 1946. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks. She stood at the rail as the ship entered New York Harbor, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the morning fog, and thought about promises and their costs. At the dock, the veterans were waiting. David Thompson, Marcus Johnson, Leonard Hayes, Robert Mitchell, and Thomas Jackson, along with their wives and families. They welcomed Greta to America with an embrace that made her believe, for the first time since James disappeared, that she might actually survive this. They brought her to Harlem, where they had arranged a small apartment. The neighborhood was vibrant, alive with music and culture, and the determination of black Americans to build something beautiful in a country that tried constantly to crush them. Greta found work as a seamstress, using skills her mother had taught her years ago. The veterans' wives helped her navigate American life, teaching her the unwritten rules that could mean the difference between safety and danger. Baby James grew into a toddler, then a young boy. Greta told him about his father, about the hero who had fought for his country and died trying to bring his family together. She showed him the photograph, the one of James standing proud in front of his tank, and taught him to see in that image not just loss, but legacy. The years passed. Greta became part of the community, known and respected as the German widow of a 761st veteran. She never remarried. She poured her energy into raising James, into building a life that honored the sacrifice his father had made. In 1978, 33 years after the war ended, the 761st Tank Battalion finally received official recognition for their service. President Jimmy Carter awarded the unit a Presidential Unit Citation, acknowledging the extraordinary heroism they had demonstrated during the war. The recognition came decades too late for many of the men who had served, including James Washington, but it came nonetheless. Greta attended the ceremony in Washington, D.C., now an older woman with gray in her hair and lines around her eyes. Her son James, now a grown man with children of his own, accompanied her. The surviving veterans of the 761st were there, including David Thompson and Marcus Johnson, both elderly now, but still carrying themselves with the dignity that had defined them. When the citation was presented, Greta stood, with tears running down her face. She wore James's dog tags as she had every day since he gave them to her in that last goodbye in Bavaria. She carried a photograph of him, the one she had shown to skeptical officials and hostile bureaucrats, the one that proved he had existed, that he had mattered, that his story was real. After the ceremony, she placed flowers at the memorial and whispered words meant only for James. She told him about their son, about the grandchildren he would never meet, about the life she had built from the pieces he had left behind. She told him that they had called her crazy for insisting he was real, but she had never doubted, not for a single moment. She had been right. He had been real. Their love had been real. And even though the world had tried to erase both, she had fought to preserve the truth. In the end, that was the only victory that mattered. The story of Greta and James Washington became part of the historical record, taught to students studying the post-war period, referenced in books about black veterans and war brides. But for those who lived it, it was never just a story. It was a testament to love's stubborn refusal to accept injustice, to courage in the face of impossible odds, and to the power of truth to survive even when systems conspired to bury it. They had called her crazy. They had called her a liar. They had tried to take her child and erase her husband from history. But Greta Washington had fought back with nothing but determination and the knowledge that she was right. And in the end, when his unit came forward, when veterans stood up and demanded recognition, when justice finally arrived decades too late, the world had to acknowledge what she had known all along. James Washington had been real. He had been a hero. He had been her husband. And no amount of bureaucratic denial, racist violence, or institutional indifference could change those fundamental truths. If Greta's story moved you, if you believe that histories like James Washington's deserve to be remembered and honored, then help us keep these stories alive. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the untold stories of courage, love, and resilience that shaped our world. Hit that like button to show your support for content that sheds light on the heroes whose sacrifices were forgotten for far too long. And please, leave a comment below. Tell us what you thought about Greta and James's story. Do you know similar stories from your own family history? Have you heard about other veterans whose contributions were erased? Your comments create a community of people who refuse to let these stories disappear. Together, we're ensuring that voices silenced by injustice can finally be heard. Subscribe, like, and comment. Let's make sure that when someone says they called her crazy, we can respond. But she was right, and we remember.